It was a Friday morning in Manhattan, the kind of morning that feels the same as 100 before it, the kind where you sip burnt coffee from a paper cup, shoulder your way through a sea of strangers, and glance up at the Empire State Building just long enough to remember you live in the greatest city on Earth. Tourists lined up early, checking their phones, laughing, posing for selfies against the skyline. Workers in suits moved fast, eyes forward, locked into the rhythm of the city. Street vendors shouted, horns blared. Life, in all its ordinary chaos, marched on. No one knew that just steps away, a man was waiting. Not waiting for a bus, not waiting for breakfast, waiting to kill. In the city that never sleeps, violence doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it walks quietly behind you in a gray suit, holding a black briefcase, looking just like everyone else. That's what makes stories like this so terrifying. Not the number of bullets fired, not even the body on the sidewalk. What chills us is how normal everything seemed, right up until the moment it wasn't. A single trigger pull, one breathless second, and the illusion shattered. This isn't just a crime story. It's a human story. One about pride and pain, silence and rage, loss and the 1,000 invisible pressures that can drive a man to snap. We're about to dive deep into one of New York's most shocking workplace shootings. But more than that, we're going to ask the questions no one wants to answer. Could it have been stopped? Who saw the signs? And how do you stop a man who spent months preparing to be invisible? Because the scariest monsters don't hide under beds. They stand beside us in elevators. They nod politely in the hallway. They smile, and they wait. This is the Empire State Building shooting, August 24th, 2012. And this is how an ordinary morning turned into something no one could forget. The thing about New York is, no one really stops moving. Everyone's got somewhere to be, somewhere to get to. Fifth Avenue, one of the busiest places on the planet. On any given morning, it's a river of life. Tourists with wide eyes and cameras. Moms pushing strollers. Executives glued to phone calls. Baristas running late. College kids with earbuds in. Construction crews yelling over the jackhammers. It's not quiet. It's never quiet. And in the middle of all that motion, something terrible was about to happen. He was already there, standing just off the curb, wearing a suit, holding a briefcase, blending in like a shadow cast by the building itself. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't yelling. He didn't look angry. He looked like someone heading into work. And that's what's so haunting. You can rewind the footage from that morning 100 times and still miss it. The moment just before the storm, when everything still looked normal. He waited for his target, waited until he was close enough to touch. A man he once worked with. A man who had no idea today would be his last. And when he saw him, just the cold efficiency of someone who had already made peace with what they were about to do, he raised the gun, one shot to the head. And in the space between that sound and the next heartbeat, the street changed. What had been ordinary became nightmare. Pedestrians screamed. Some dropped to the ground. Others ran. A few froze. A construction worker, just feet away, ducked behind scaffolding, heart racing. A woman holding her daughter's hand yanked her off the sidewalk, not yet sure where the danger was. A tourist, camera still in hand, caught the sound on video without meaning to, and the shooter didn't run. He stepped forward, aimed down, and fired again, and again, and again. 5 shots in total, all within 15 seconds. Then, as calmly as he came, he turned, slipped the gun back into his briefcase, and began walking back into the crowd. What happened on that sidewalk was fast, but its shockwaves would stretch across the city. In those few seconds, the rules broke, the illusion shattered. Because if someone can stand on a public street, in broad daylight, surrounded by people and cameras and noise, and still kill with such focus and calm. What does that say about the rage we don't see, about the people we pass every single day, and about the storms that live just under the surface? 15 seconds. That's all it took. For Midtown to base, to hold its breath, and for New York to remember just how fragile morning can be. In every crime story, there's the moment it all falls apart. Two lives moving in opposite directions, until one decides to stop the other. That's what happened here. Two men, two paths, and somewhere along the way, they collided. The first was Stephen Ercolino, 41, vice president at a fashion company. Confident, outgoing. He had charm. He had presence. He walked into a room and people noticed. He was the kind of guy who made friends quickly, laughed loudly, got things done. He lived in Hoboken, across the river, with his girlfriend, took the PATH train to Midtown every morning. He had family, people who loved him. He worked hard, pushed for results. To some, maybe he came off intense, but in New York, that's how you survive. And then there was Jeffrey T. Johnson, 58, a designer, an artist, quiet, precise. He didn't talk much, didn't go out much. He lived alone, with his cats, in a small apartment on the Upper East Side. Every morning, he put on the same clean suit, picked up coffee from the same McDonald's, read the paper, went home, and drew. He wasn't loud. He wasn't late. He did his job and followed the rules. But inside, something was changing. Johnson had been let go from the company over a year before. A downsizing, budget cuts, a cold line in a corporate memo. To most people, it was just business. But to him, it felt personal. He blamed Stephen, not just for the job, but for everything that came after. The financial stress, the eviction notice, the way people stopped calling, and maybe worst of all, he lost something that never made it onto a paycheck. His place in the world. Because when you're a man of routines, a man who shows up early, stays late, never causes trouble, and then they take your desk, take your name off the door, tell you you're not needed anymore, what's left? Johnson kept coming back to the office, not as an employee, but as a ghost. He'd show up unannounced, run into Stephen, in the elevator, say things that made people uneasy. Sometimes it got physical, sometimes it got quiet. They filed complaints against each other. Both said they felt threatened, but nothing ever came of it. Just more paperwork, more silence. And maybe that silence was the most dangerous thing of all, because Stephen kept moving forward, planning meetings, living his life. And Johnson, he stayed still, drawing in his apartment, carrying the weight of everything he couldn't say. He wasn't the kind of man you notice in a crowd, but he noticed everything, every slight, every word, every time he felt overlooked, dismissed, forgotten, until all that quiet became something sharp. Something loaded, something ready, 2 men, 2 lives, and for one of them. This story ended in an elevator, with a promise made through gritted teeth, I'm going to kill you. That wasn't just a threat, it was a decision. Most workplace conflicts don't start with shouting. They start with tension, with looks that linger a second too long, with words that feel sharp even when spoken softly. At Hazan Imports, the office was not big. Desks were close, hallways were narrow, and 2 men who could not stand each other were forced to share the same space day after day. Stephen Ercolino was a sales executive. He pushed. He demanded. He wanted results. In his world, speed mattered. Pressure was normal. That's how deals got closed. Jeffrey Johnson was different. He was detail-driven. Methodical. He believed in hierarchy, in process, in doing things the right way. And he did not like being told what to do by someone he did not respect. At first, It was subtle. A comment here, a delay there. Stephen asking for samples faster. Johnson taking his time. But tension, when ignored, doesn't fade. It ferments. Coworkers noticed it. They felt it when both men were in the room. The air got heavier. Conversations shortened. People chose sides without meaning to. Then it got physical. An elbow thrown in an elevator. A hand at the throat. Words that crossed a line no one should ever cross. I am going to kill you. Those words were not shouted in a movie scene. They were spoken inside a cramped elevator, between two men who had worked together for years. And once words like that exist, they never disappear. Both men went to the police. Both filed complaints. Both said they felt threatened. And then nothing happened. No arrest, no restraining order, no serious intervention, just paperwork and time. Time can heal, but time can also harden resentment into something dangerous. Johnson was laid off during downsizing. He believed Stephen was responsible. Not partially, completely. From that moment on, every setback had a face. Every bill he couldn't pay. Every night he lay awake in his apartment. Every morning he put on a suit with nowhere to go. Stephen moved on. Meetings, travel, life. Johnson stayed behind. Alone, isolated, replaying conversations that no one else remembered anymore. This is where workplace violence often begins. Not with rage, but with rumination. Psychologists call it grievance fixation. The mind loops the same injustice over and over until it becomes identity, until the grievance is no longer about the job, but about dignity. Johnson didn't scream. He didn't lash out online. He didn't warn anyone. He showed up. Months after losing his job, he kept returning to the office building, running into Stephen, standing too close, saying just enough to be unsettling. Coworkers described walking on eggshells. But eggshells don't stop pressure. They just crack quietly. And that is the most dangerous kind of conflict. The one that everyone senses, but no one fully addresses. Discomfort is often dismissed as personality clashes, as stress, as something that will work itself out. But unresolved hostility does not work itself out. It waits. Johnson was losing more than a paycheck. He was losing control. And in his mind, there was only one person standing between him and justice. Stephen never saw it coming. To him, the conflict was old. Something already dealt with. A bad chapter closed. But to Johnson, it was still happening. Every day, every morning he woke up. And when resentment has nowhere to go, it turns inward. Until one day, it turns outward. Workplace violence rarely feels sudden to the person committing it. It feels inevitable, a final act, a way to balance the scales, a moment where all the pain is handed back. And once that decision is made, the workplace is no longer an office. It becomes a stage. The morning of August 24th, 2012, was not random. It was chosen. The location was chosen. The time was chosen. And the target was chosen. What happened next would unfold in seconds. But the violence itself had been building for years. It was 9:03 on a Friday morning, the kind of morning when most people were already halfway through their to-do list. When coffee was still hot, when the city hadn't quite settled, but was no longer waking up, and on West 33rd Street, just outside the office building, they chatted as they walked toward the entrance. Across the street, Jeffrey Johnson was already waiting, standing still, behind a white delivery van, suit pressed, face unreadable, briefcase in hand. There are moments in history that feel blurry, moments where memory plays tricks, but not this one. This one is crystal clear, because it was captured on camera by a building security feed. by tourists filming their day, by bystanders too shocked to look away. Johnson waited until Stephen was only steps from the door. He didn't yell. He didn't call his name. He stepped out and raised the gun. It was a .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun. Heavy. Loud. Final. The first shot was to the head. Stephen collapsed instantly. But Johnson wasn't done. He stepped forward, stood over the body, and fired again. 4 more times. At close range. Each shot measured. Each one personal. People screamed. A woman dropped her coffee. A man dove behind a parked car. A mother grabbed her child and ran. It all happened in under 15 seconds. But for the people there, it felt like an hour trapped in one heartbeat. Another thought it was balloons popping, until they saw blood and silence. Johnson turned, slipped the gun into his briefcase, straightened his jacket, and walked away, not running, not hiding, just walking. He turned the corner onto 5th Avenue. Tourists were already lining up at the Empire State Building. 2 NYPD officers stood near the entrance. One of them had just been tipped off by a construction worker. The man in the gray suit. He just shot someone. They turned and saw him. He saw them too. For a split second, they stood facing each other. The crowd all around. No cover, no time, no second chance. Johnson reached for his gun. But before he could fire, the officers did. 16 shots were fired in total. 7 hit Johnson. He collapsed immediately. But in those few seconds, something else happened. 9 bystanders were injured. 3 struck directly by bullets. Others wounded by fragments, concrete, glass, ricochet. People ran in every direction. Some hid behind planters. Some ducked into shops. Some froze, unsure where to go. And then came the quiet. The kind of quiet that feels too loud. Sirens still far away. Smoke in the air. Bodies on the ground. People crying. Calling names. Looking for strangers they had stood beside just seconds earlier. The entire city paused. Not because it was the first time something like this had happened, but because it could have been anyone. No one saw it coming. No one had time to run. No one had a script. 1 second, you're a tourist taking a photo. The next, you're crouched on the pavement, bleeding, wondering how a morning turned into a war zone. For the officers, it was a split-second decision. Protect the crowd. And they did. But there is no clean victory in a moment like this, because no matter how quickly justice arrives, it's already too late. Stephen was dead. Johnson was dead. And 9 people who didn't know either man were left with wounds that would take longer to heal than anyone could predict. It wasn't a hostage negotiation. It wasn't hours of live news coverage. It was 15 seconds. 15 seconds that changed lives, that haunted witnesses, that made national headlines, and reminded New York and the world just how quickly a single human choice can collapse a morning. There was no chase, no getaway car, no dramatic standoff behind police tape. It all happened right there, in the shadow of one of the world's most iconic buildings, in front of people just trying to start their day. After the shooting, Jeffrey Johnson turned the corner, walked east onto 5th Avenue toward the Empire State Building, toward the crowd, toward the uniformed officers. Standing at the front steps, he blended in. Until he didn't. A construction worker had followed him, watched his calm, watched the way he slipped into the crowd like a commuter, and knew something was wrong. He pointed him out to the officers. That man, gray suit, black bag, he just shot someone. They turned, locked eyes with Johnson. And in that instant, time stretched thin. He saw them, and they saw the truth. Johnson reached into his bag, began to pull the gun out again. And in that breath, that single choice, Two officers opened fire. 16 shots. In just a few seconds, 7 struck Johnson. He collapsed onto the pavement, gun still in hand, briefcase by his side. But the bullets did not stop with him. 9 bystanders were hit, 3 directly by gunfire, 6 more by debris, by fragments, by ricochets. Innocent people, men and women, aged 20 to 56, caught in the line of defense. This wasn't negligence, it was chaos. In a densely packed street, with stone buildings, steel poles, glass storefronts, a bullet doesn't always land where you expect. One man was selling tour tickets nearby. Another was walking to work. A woman had just stepped out of a coffee shop. A couple from out of town was looking up at the building. Their day forever changed. The officers did what they were trained to do. Stop the threat. Protect the crowd. React fast. React first. Or never react. Again, neither of those officers had fired their weapon in the field. Before that morning was their first time, and their last. The decision to pull the trigger is one thing. Living with it is another. There's a weight that stays with you, not just from the body on the ground, but from the voices, the headlines, the questions. Could it have gone differently? Should they have waited? Was there another way? But in that moment, there is no perfect answer. There is no script, just instinct and training and fear, all colliding in half a second. They saw a man who had already killed, saw him reaching for the same weapon, and they fired to stop him before he could fire again. And they did. The gun was still loaded, 2 rounds left in the magazine, more ammunition in the briefcase. If they had waited, if they had hesitated, even for a breath, we might be telling a very different story. The NYPD later confirmed every civilian injury came from police fire, not from Johnson, and that is not a point of blame. It is a point of tragedy. Because when violence erupts in a crowd, no action is clean, no outcome perfect. You protect as best you can. You aim with urgency. You pray no one else gets hurt. But sometimes, even when everything goes right, everything still feels wrong. The Empire State Building. 1 man lay dead. 9 more were bleeding. 2 officers were forever changed, and dozens of witnesses would carry the sound of gunfire in their ears, long after the streets were swept and the cameras had gone home. 16. In just a few seconds, but the echoes lasted much longer. When the gunfire stopped, the work began. Not just the medical response, not just the press, but the part we rarely see, the slow, a careful work of understanding what really happened. Because after tragedy, there are always questions. Always versions of the story. Always the need to know what is real. The scene outside the Empire State Building was locked down within minutes. Dozens of officers. Yellow tape stretched across the sidewalk. Cameras swarming from every direction. But the most important evidence was already there. Lying on the ground, embedded in the walls, stored in the memories of those who saw it happen. The forensic team arrived quietly. No shouting, no drama, just measured steps, gloved hands, steady breaths. They began with the obvious. The bodies, one covered. One surrounded Stephen Ercolino, still where he had fallen. 5 bullets to the body, most at close range. Jeffrey Johnson, lying on his back, briefcase beside him, gun still within reach. 7 rounds from police. Fire had struck him. 2 bullets remained in his weapon. More found inside the bag. Next came the shell casings. Scattered across the sidewalk, 16 fired by the officers. 5 by Johnson. Each one carefully tagged, photographed, bagged, mapped. Then the blood trails the direction of spatter. The impact. Marks on metal poles, stone planters, glass doors. All told a story. Ballistics experts examined the angles, measured distances, calculated velocity, where the bullets entered, where they changed course, where they stopped. Because in a city like New York, no shot is ever simple. Bullets bounce, fragments fly, Split-second decisions can ripple through an entire block. Meanwhile, detectives began speaking with witnesses. There was the tourist from Australia who filmed part of the scene. His voice trembling, his hands shaking, not sure why he kept recording, just knowing something terrible was happening. There was the construction worker who followed Johnson, who saw the way he walked. Not fast, not slow, just steady, like someone heading toward the end of something. There was the woman who dropped her coffee, the man who ducked behind a car, the mother who shielded her daughter, each one with a different angle, each one with a different fear. And then there was the building's security footage, silent, black and white, but undeniable. It showed Johnson stepping from behind the van, raising the gun, firing once, then again and again. It showed Stephen fall. It showed people scatter. It showed Johnson walk away like it meant nothing. The video didn't lie. It didn't shout. It just showed. That was the hardest part for many who watched it. The calm, the precision, the complete absence of hesitation. Investigators pieced it all together, not just to prove what happened, but to understand it, to give context to chaos, to make sense of something that, in the moment, felt senseless. And what they found confirmed what many already feared. This was not random. This was not confusion. This was planned, deliberate, personal. A targeted killing in a public place, followed by a confrontation with police that almost became a second massacre. But it didn't. Because someone saw, because someone spoke, because two officers acted fast. Still, the facts do not erase the pain. They do not heal the wounds. They do not silence the echoes. But they give us something to hold on to. A record, a truth, a way to remember. Not just what happened, but how it happened, and why it must never happen. Again, the gunman was dead, the threat was over, but 9 other people, 9, who had nothing to do with him, nothing to do with the conflict, were lying on the pavement, bleeding, shaken, afraid. What happened? Why them? That question lingered long after the headlines faded. This wasn't a shootout in an alley. It wasn't in a deserted parking lot. It happened on Fifth Avenue, on a bright Friday morning, in the heart of Midtown Manhattan, where thousands move like clockwork, every hour of the day. The officers responded fast. Too fast for anyone else to get hurt. Or so we thought. But forensic science tells a more complicated story. Because in the real world, bullets don't always follow straight lines. The officers fired 16 rounds. Their target was clear. Their mission, urgent. Stop the man who had just killed, before he could kill again. 7 of those bullets hit Johnson. But 9 civilians were wounded. Some directly by bullets, some by fragments, some by concrete or glass struck by ricochets. And none of them saw it coming. Here is what happens in a dense urban environment. When a gun is fired, the bullet travels fast, faster than the sound of the shot. And when it hits something solid, it doesn't always stop. Sometimes it deflects, bounces, splinters, even the smallest piece of metal, moving at hundreds of feet per second, can cut through flesh, tear muscle, shatter bone. It doesn't matter if you're behind a pole or near a wall or holding your daughter's hand while looking up at the skyline. The physics doesn't care. This is what forensic teams faced in the hours after the shooting. Mapping out trajectories, calculating angles, measuring distances, trying to understand exactly how it happened. One man was struck in the arm, another in the leg. A woman suffered a graze to the head. One victim said she thought someone had thrown a rock until she saw the blood. There were no warning signs. No time to duck, no place to hide, because in that moment everyone was a bystander, and every direction held risk. This is the side of gun violence that rarely makes headlines. The unintended harm, the people caught in the radius, the names that don't appear in the main story, but live with the scars. Some wounds healed, some didn't. Some of those 9 went home that night, bandaged and bruised, grateful to be alive. Others struggled with fear, long after crossing streets differently, jumping at loud sounds, avoiding crowds, looking over their 19. After their 19, people, shoulders, even when they knew they were safe. And the officers, they carried their own wounds, invisible ones. They had done their job, and yet they were part of the harm. That is the brutal math of public shootings. Even when you win, you lose something. The NYPD was transparent. They confirmed all civilian injuries came from police bullets, not from Johnson. But that fact, that admission didn't come with blame, it came with sorrow. Because the truth is, in a moment like that, there are no clean victories, only broken seconds, and what you try to salvage afterward. This was not carelessness, not cruelty. It was the MBEO. Tragic cost of urgency. The price of choosing action. Hesitation. And while forensic science can explain the angles, the distances, the speeds, it cannot measure the guilt, the pain, the what-ifs that live in the silence after 9 innocent people. Not part of the story, became part of the story. Trauma. Because when bullets fly, they don't ask for context. They don't care who you are. All they need is a line, a surface, a moment, and they change everything. To understand what happened, we have to go somewhere uncomfortable. Inside the mind of the man who pulled the trigger. Not to excuse him, not to soften the truth, but to understand how a human being reaches a point where violence feels justified. Jeffrey Johnson did not wake up one morning and decide to become a killer. That idea is comforting, because it allows us to believe monsters are born overnight. But reality is far more disturbing. Violence like this grows slowly, quietly, in isolation. Psychologists call it tunnel thinking. A mental state where the world narrows until there is only one story. One. Enemy one. Solution for Johnson. That tunnel had a name, Stephen Ercolino. Over time, every frustration began to point in the same direction. The lost job, the financial pressure, the eviction notice, the feeling of being erased. Wrong, there was always a reason, and that reason always had a face. This is how obsession forms. Not as madness, but as repetition. The same memory replayed, the same grievance rehearsed, the same conversations rewritten in the mind. Again and again, Johnson was not loud about his pain. He did not cry for help. He did not break down in public. He withdrew. He lived alone, spent long hours in his apartment, drawing, replaying the past, reimagining moments where he felt disrespected, overlooked, humiliated. And when a person has no one to challenge their thoughts, no one to interrupt the loop, those thoughts harden. They stop being feelings and become beliefs. In tunnel thinking, the target is no longer human. They are reduced to a symbol, a representation of everything that went wrong. That is a dangerous shift, because once someone is no longer seen as a person, harming them no longer feels like murder. It feels like correction, like justice, like balance. This is why threats are so important to take seriously. Not because they always lead to action, but because they reveal what is happening inside. And for more calm, and probably into tensors, and probably mania, tensor ready, when the Stefri one of ready, were also 7 nations and 1 ready, when Johnson said, "I am going to kill you." It was not just anger, it was leakage, a glimpse into a mind that had already crossed a line, but no one stopped him, and the mind kept moving down the tunnel toward a single outcome. Another critical factor is identity loss. For many men of Johnson's generation, work was not just income. It was identity, structure, purpose. When that was taken away, there was nothing left to anchor him. He kept wearing the suit, kept the routine, kept the appearance of normal life. But inside, the structure had collapsed. And collapse does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks calm, controlled, calculated. By the time Johnson stepped behind that van, the decision had already been made. Not chaos. It was closure. That is the most chilling part. To him, the violence was not impulsive. It was inevitable. And that is what makes tunnel thinking so dangerous. Once the mind locks onto a single solution, every other option disappears. Help, distance, time, forgiveness. None of it exists anymore, only the end. This does not mean Johnson was beyond responsibility. It means the warning signs were visible and missed. Isolation, fixation, explicit threats, unresolved conflict. These are not random details. They are signals. And when they go unaddressed, irreversible harm. Understanding this psychology does not bring Stephen back. It does not heal the 9 injured. It does not erase the trauma. But it gives us something else. Awareness. Because the most dangerous violence is not the loud kind, is the quiet kind. Polite smiles and pressed suits until one day the tunnel ends and everyone else is pulled into the darkness with it. Stephen Ercolino woke up that morning, got dressed, took the train from Hoboken, maybe checked his phone, maybe kissed his girlfriend goodbye, maybe thought about the weekend ahead. He was 41. He had a family, a career, a life filled with plans that would never be finished, and in less than 15 seconds, all of it was gone. Stephen wasn't famous. He didn't make the front page every day. But to the people who loved him, he was everything. A son, a brother, a partner, a friend. He worked hard, laughed loudly, argued when he believed in something, pushed for what he wanted, flawed, but human, fully human. And that is what violence steals from us. Not just lives, but layers. The sound of someone's voice, the way they walked into a room, the texts left unread, the voicemail never returned, the empty seat at the table. But Stephen wasn't the only one whose day was torn apart. 9 others were hurt. Innocent people, strangers, just passing through. There was a woman from North Carolina visiting the city for the first time. Her trip ended in a hospital bed, staring at white walls. Far from home, there was a tour worker, shot in the arm, he said. Later, I guess stuff happens. But you could hear the tremble in his voice. There were people who were grazed, not just by bullets, but by fear. The kind that stays with you when you cross the street, when you hear a bang, when someone walks too close. And then there were the silent wounds, the ones we can't see. The people who weren't hit, but watched it unfold. Who heard the shots, felt the ground shake, saw someone fall, and couldn't do anything to stop it. They walked away, but nothing felt normal again, and we rarely talk about them. The witnesses, the almost victims, the ones who were spared, but not untouched. That's the thing about violence in public spaces. It doesn't just take one life. It cuts through dozens, inches away, seconds apart, forever changed. We often focus on the why, on the man with the gun, on the timeline, the motive, the investigation, but we forget the people left holding the pieces, the girlfriend who never got that goodbye, the parents who had to bury a child, the coworkers who kept showing up to the same building, walking past the same spot, pretending they weren't looking down. They didn't ask to be part of the story, but now they live in it. And every year, every August, every time they pass that block, something inside them stops. Because once you hear a free gunshot up close, you don't hear the city the same way again. Stephen should have gone to lunch that day, laughed at something dumb, sent a text that meant nothing, lived a day that didn't matter. But sometimes, the days that don't matter are the ones we never get back. After the sirens faded, after the street was cleaned, after the headlines moved on, there were still questions, not just about Jeffrey Johnson or Stephen Ercolino, but about the system, the structure, the way we handle conflict before it becomes clued and faded. Tragedy. This wasn't just about a man with a gun. It was about the cracks he slipped through. Johnson had made threats. He had been in physical altercations. There were documented complaints filed by both men, police reports, HR memos, moments where someone could have said, this isn't just tension, this is danger. But nothing happened, no action, no follow-up, no real safety net. And in that silence, the story grew darker. The truth is, most workplaces aren't built to handle people in pain or people unraveling slowly. We talk about wellness, we talk about support. But when someone shows signs of obsession, of fixation, of hostility, too often we look away because it's uncomfortable, because we don't, I want to make it worse, because we hope it will just pass until it doesn't. This case forced hard conversations about workplace violence, about what HR really means, about where responsibility begins and where it ends. Should someone have followed up on the threats? Should Johnson have been flagged? Should coworkers have pushed harder? Should the company have stepped in? There's no single answer. But what we know is this. When red flags are raised, when someone says, I am afraid of this person, we cannot afford to wait. We cannot afford to file and forget. Because no one wants to believe a colleague could become violent. But denial doesn't keep people safe. Action does. Companies started reviewing their policies. Security at entrances tightened. Threat assessment teams were formed. But change doesn't come easy, and it doesn't come fast. It requires more than training videos. It requires listening, not just when someone is yelling, but when someone grows quiet. It requires understanding. That mental health is not a side note, it's central to safety, to stability, to being seen before it's too late. And it requires knowing that preventing violence is not just about stopping a weapon, it's about noticing a person before they disappear behind a mask. After the shooting, New York didn't just grieve. It asked, how do we protect people who don't know they're in danger? How do we create workplaces where warning signs are heard, where silence is not mistaken for peace? Because sometimes, the loudest cries for help are the ones no one hears.